It is wonderful being here in the Ronald Reagan building in a room filled with Texans. Let me tell you, this town always gets better when the ratio of boots to people goes up. And let me say to Frank Gaffney, the Center for Security Policy, thank you for the tremendous honor you've bestowed tonight. Thank you for your clear, clarion vision, your courage, and your leadership. It makes an extraordinary difference. I want to talk about two things. One, I hate podiums. I want to talk about two things. One, we recognize some Texas heroes, and let me say to the men and women from Texas who were recognized here, these are warriors of principle, these are dear friends, these are incredible heroes, and thank you for recognizing each and every one of these incredible men and women tonight. Two things I want to talk about are, number one, Texas and the tragedies we've seen in the last couple of months. And then number two, I want to talk about nationally, the threats facing America and the power of truth. But let's start closer to home. Let's start with Texas. A couple of months ago, we saw the horrific Hurricane Harvey strike the state of Texas. And I'll tell you, Harvey was unlike anything we'd ever seen before. I grew up in Houston. We're used to hurricanes. But when Harvey came in, it started in South Texas, slamming into South Texas, devastating communities like Victoria and Rockport and Port Aransas and Aransas Pass and Refugio. Then it moved north to Houston, my hometown, where it sat over the city of Houston for 4 days, like your in-laws at Christmas. It didn't have the good sense and decency to know when to move on. Dumped 51 inches of rain on the city of Houston, and then moved east, flooding communities like Beaumont and Port Arthur and Orange and Nederland. It was an epic disaster. And yet that's not the story of Harvey. The story of Harvey I find inspiring because the story of Harvey was a story of bravery of first responders, of firefighters, of police officers, and EMS who risked their lives, of Coast Guardsmen who dove into choppy waters, of National Guardsmen who rescued people. And I'll tell you, I think the true story of Harvey was the thousands of ordinary Texans that just jumped in a boat to save their neighbors. Rednecks and bass boats. I think the very face of Texas. That heroism, in the face of the disaster, saving people's lives, and in the wake of the disaster, rebuilding, where you saw sacrifice, you saw love, you saw compassion, you saw nobody waiting around for somebody else to come help, but everyone saying, I see my friend or neighbor in trouble, I'm stepping forward and doing the job. And we saw that very same spirit a little over a week ago in Sutherland Springs, Texas. I spent 2 days last week in Sutherland Springs, all day Monday and all day Wednesday. Whereas we know, the Sunday before, a vicious madman had walked into a church and opened fire on innocents. I stood in that sanctuary. One of the most horrifying things I've ever seen in my life. This madman executed men, women, and children with rifle shots to the head, children as young as 18 months. But again, the story of Sutherland Springs is not the madman. It is the reaction in the face of evil, the response to the disaster. One of the people I got a chance to get to know last week is a fellow named Stephen Williford. Stephen's a plumber. He's a plumber who lives about a block away from the church. And when the shooting was happening, his daughter told him there's a shooting down at the church. Stephen went to his gun safe, he took out his rifle, and he ran down to the church. He ran so quickly, he ran barefoot. He didn't even take time to put on his shoes. And he sheltered behind a pickup truck and engaged the shooter. The shooter was getting ready to shoot a woman in the church until Stephen Williford engaged him. He's an NRA rifle instructor, holding an AR-15, which, can I say, drives the mainstream media nuts. This deranged madman was wearing body armor, but Stephen Williford is a good enough marksman that he put one round in his side between the body plates, another round in his leg, and he shot the madman. I asked the state and local law enforcement what would have happened if Mr. Williford hadn't engaged. Every single one of the law enforcement officers said many, many more people would have died that day. Not only that, the gunman threw down his rifle, jumped in a car, sped off, badly bleeding. Stephen Williford waved down another passing individual. He didn't know him. Now, I want you to picture, you're driving your truck down a small town. You see a guy with a white beard who you don't know, who's barefoot waving an AR-15. And here's the Texas reaction. How you doing, sir? Can I help you? And Williford said, well, some lunatic just shot up the church. Get in, let's go. And they pursued him and directed law enforcement to where he was. Finally, the shooter took his own life. Let me tell you, as I visited with that community, the pastor of that church, Pastor Pomeroy, is a Navy veteran, incredible man. He happened not to be there that day. He and his wife, they're there almost every Sunday. That Sunday, he happened to be gone. His wife, you know why his wife was gone? She was down in Florida helping out with FEMA with hurricane relief. But they tragically lost their 14-year-old daughter in that church that morning. And their entire community was devastated. The first time I saw Pastor Pomeroy on Monday, he said, look, I don't know if our church will come back. We may be done. I don't know if we can rebuild. I don't know what we can do. And let me tell you, that pastor grieving for his own child, that community is resting on those broad shoulders. And 2 days later, on Wednesday, he said, I've never seen such an outpouring. People have contributed. They've already covered the cost of the funerals of everyone who's murdered. We've got people who've contributed to rebuild the church in another location. And everyone in the church, in the hospital, says, Pastor, we're going to rebuild and we're going to come back stronger than ever. I was at the hospital where a number of the individuals shot in that church where I was at BAMC. And I was introduced to a gentleman named Dale. Dale, mid-50s, was on a ventilator, badly shot. His right arm was shot up completely. He was there with his whole family. But Dale was conscious, he could communicate, and he could write with his left hand. It was kind of scratchy, couldn't do it very well, but his left hand was free to write. When I came in, he had written on a piece of paper, he gave it to me. He said, don't blame God. This is evil. I spent a little bit of time visiting with Dale, visiting with his family. And then they said, would you be willing to pray for him, pray with us? I said, I'd be honored. So we held hands. I began to pray, God, please heal Dale, touch Dale, cure these wounds. And God, use this to make Dale a stronger witness in his community. Use this to enable Dale to help others who are hurting. Use this, what Satan has meant for evil, use this for good. So at the end of the prayer, Dale gestured for the notepad again. And he wrote with his left hand, real scraggly, he wrote, love your thoughts, I am David. And I turned to the commanding general at BAMC. I said, General, you told me his name was Dale. You threw me under the bus. And his family said, well, when he checked in yesterday, nobody knew his name. He's been on all the lists as Dale. They've been calling you Dale for 2 days. The whole family were laughing. And David asked, bring the sheet over, and he just wrote 3 words. He wrote, laugh is good. That's the spirit of Texas. That's the spirit of America. We are a people who stands up and meets the challenge. And that spirit is how we defeat the challenge. Now let's take that principle and apply it to the foreign policy and national security threats facing this country. What I want to reflect on is the power of truth. Truth has a clarifying power. Why do you think it is the left engages in political correctness? Because they're terrified of the truth. Why is it that college campuses censor free speech? Because truth terrifies them. The only way lies can survive is if the truth is silenced. So let's take a quick run through some parts of the world. I'll focus on the Middle East and America, although we could talk another day about Russia or China or Central and South America, all the challenges. But let's focus for a moment on Middle East and America. Let's start with Iran. Iran, I believe, poses the single greatest national security threat to the United States on the face of the planet. The Ayatollah Khamenei is a zealot, and even worse than that, he is a religious zealot. When he pledges death to America and death to Israel, I believe him. You know, a man known as the father of the Iranian nuclear program, a man who met an untimely death, some say at the hands of the Israeli Mossad. He had written in his last will and testament that he wanted the following printed on his tombstone: here lies a man who sought the annihilation of Israel. I want you to think for a second about the bilious hatred that causes someone to write that in their last will and testament. For all eternity, the only thing you want the world to know is that you're such a vicious anti-Semite that you spent your entire life seeking mass murder. You know, there was a political cartoon I saw a couple of years ago that had the Ayatollah Khamenei saying, "Death to America!" and had John Kerry saying, "Can we meet you halfway?" There's not a middle ground with someone whose objective is to murder you. Now, I want to commend President Trump for decertifying the Iranian nuclear deal. It was the right thing to do. All of the Washington press, all of the Washington foreign policy establishment were running around, ranting their garments, pulling their hair. It was a great sign that he'd done something right. Basically, the more they wail, the better you know the action was. And it was exactly right. There's no way the president could, in good conscience, certify that Iran is complying with this deal when they're openly flouting the deal, nor could he certify that it's in the national security interest of the United States. But I will say, at the time it was said, well, Congress needs to step in and fix the deal. Color me skeptical, but I don't have a whole lot of faith of Congress stepping in to fix nothing on this. But here's the good news. Under existing law, You don't need Congress to act. Under existing law, President Donald J. Trump can unilaterally reimpose sanctions on Iran, and I believe that's exactly what the president should do. Giving billions of dollars to people who hate you, who are working to develop nuclear technology and ICBM technology, is lunacy. And by the way, it's worth noting, an ICBM, it's not to hit Israel. You don't need an ICBM to get to Israel. An ICBM is for one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to get to the United States of America. And not a one of us wants to wake up to discover that Iran has achieved its goal of a nuclear arsenal by looking in the sky and seeing a mushroom cloud over New York or Los Angeles or Washington, D.C. Here's a very simple principle of life. When somebody tells you they want to kill you, believe them. Remember what I said about truth. Look, Khamenei, while negotiating with John Kerry, literally at the same time, was leading mobs chanting, "Death to America." Exactly how thick-headed do you have to be? Hey, Ayatollah, what were you doing? Oh, death to America. Wait, that's us. It's one of the things the Center for Security Policy and Frank Gaffney does such a great job is speaking the truth about what that threat is. And listen, there are those voices that say, well, gosh, if you reimpose sanctions on Iran, our European allies won't go along. Well, let me ask you, there are a number of people here in business. How many of you, if given a choice between doing business with the United States of America or doing business with Iran, how many of you would choose Iran? It's fairly simple math. The Iranian sanctions started out as American sanctions. Our allies came along with American leadership to begin with, and our allies will come along with continued American leadership. The result of the Obama-Iranian nuclear deal is not only has Iran had billions of dollars flow into its coffers, but you're seeing Iranian influence move throughout the Middle East, throughout North Africa, down into South America. And there is nothing more important for the national security interests of the United States this administration could do than utilize every tool we have, economic, diplomatic, and if need be, military, to ensure that in no circumstances ever, ever, ever will the Ayatollah have nuclear weapons. And then shifting to ISIS and Iraq. One of the great foreign policy victories of this administration have been the advances we've made against ISIS. As we've seen stronghold after stronghold fall, and ISIS losing territorial bases, losing the income that comes from being a nation state, that is a tremendous victory. And it's actually quite interesting. Early on, the spring of this year, I was talking with one of our senior military leaders who at the time predicted, he said, by late this year, ISIS will have lost all or virtually all of their territory. They'll be reduced to still dangerous, but a transnational terrorist organization without a nation state as a base. And I asked him, I said, General, that's a striking prediction. We've been fighting with ISIS a long time. What has changed? Why do you believe we are winning now when we were losing before? And his answer was fascinating. His answer, he said, the rules of engagement, they haven't really changed. He said, the only thing that's changed is the president has delegated to the commanders decision-making on the battlefield, which in turn meant that they have delegated decision-making down the chain of command. And what this general proceeded to tell me, he said, listen, under the Obama administration, the White House, the National Security Council, was making tactical decisions on the battlefield, quite literally deploying troops, 20 soldiers here, 30 soldiers there. He said in the Pentagon, they called Susan Rice General Rice. And he said what's changed is the very simple decision that now when our warfighters confront the enemy, they don't have to wait for some political operative in the White House to sign off on it. They can engage the enemy and defeat the enemy. That's the power of truth. ISIS is the enemy. The Ayatollah Khamenei is the enemy. Both are radical Islamic terrorism. One Sunni, one Shia. Both seek the objective of murdering us. And clarity enables you to defeat the enemy. It also enables you to understand the enemy. It's one of the reasons why I have long been fighting in Congress to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. Frank and the Center for Security Policy have done such a terrific job of highlighting the Muslim Brotherhood's open and aggressive embrace of jihad. Speaking the truth. Look, the foreign policy establishment wants to pretend that people who say our objective is to wage jihad, our objective is to murder Americans, that they're somehow our friends. That makes no sense. And let me tell you, that same blindness abroad, we see manifested at home. Last year, I chaired a hearing in the Senate on the willful blindness of the administration to radical Islamic terrorism. We heard testimony from a whistleblower in the Department of Homeland Security who described how the Obama administration had altered or deleted over 800 records at DHS to remove any reference to Islam, jihad, Muslim Brotherhood. He described how it was ordered from the White House, and the words the White House used was purge your records. Purge was the White House term. Now listen, some might say, well, gosh, what does it matter? It's just semantics. What difference does it make? Well, it makes a difference if the objective is to protect ourselves and to stop these terrorist attacks. One of the most dismaying things in the last 8 years have been how many of these terrorist attacks we've known about the terrorists beforehand. We've had red flags out the wazoo, and we failed to act to prevent them. Nidal Hassan, who murdered 14 innocent souls, Fort Hood. The Obama administration knew that he was communicating with a radical Islamic cleric, Anwar al-Awlaki, knew that he had inquired about the permissibility of waging jihad against his fellow soldiers. And yet they did nothing. I'll tell you an interesting story from the presidential campaign trail. I was doing an interview with one of the Sunday show hosts on the campaign bus. We were talking about radical Islamic terrorism, and I said exactly what I just said, and this host said, "That's not true. That's simply objectively false. What you're saying is not true." And I told the host, I said, "Look, these are all public facts. You can look this up." 20 minutes later after the interview, the host came to me and said, "Wow, I did some Google on this and everything you're saying is true." I didn't know that. And actually the host asked, "Can I just delete the whole segment?" Which ultimately is what they did. They just didn't air it. Now ask yourself why If our government knows a soldier is talking with a radical Islamic cleric asking about the permissibility of waging jihad and murdering his fellow soldiers, why do you not have armed men showing up at his door and putting him in handcuffs that minute? We saw the same pattern with the Boston Marathon bomber, where we were informed the Zarnaf brothers were radical Islamic terrorists. The FBI went and interviewed them and then dropped the ball, stopped monitoring them. Why? Well, because if you're not looking for radical Islamic terrorism, the mandate to pay attention to them and keep watching them becomes far less acute. The elder brother posted on YouTube a public call to jihad before he loaded a pressure cooker with explosives and nails and ball bearings. The previous administration was no longer watching the brothers, so they didn't stop that attack. We saw the same pattern in San Bernardino. We saw the same pattern in Orlando at the nightclub. You know, the Orlando nightclub, the terrorist there called 911, pledged his allegiance to ISIS and al-Baghdadi. Did it on tape. You got a tape of him saying, I am doing this because of my allegiance to ISIS. The Obama Department of Justice released the tape and edited out the portion pledging his allegiance to ISIS and al-Baghdadi. And then Loretta Lynch, the Attorney General, had the gall to say publicly, we may never know why he committed this attack. The guy literally picked up the phone and called and left a tape-recorded message explaining why he did the attack. If we have a government that is willfully blind, that won't confront the enemy, that won't name the enemy, then we have a government that can't defeat the enemy and cannot act to prevent acts of terrorism before they occur. Now, we're a year into a new administration. I, for one, am incredibly thankful that Donald Trump defeated Hillary Clinton. Had Hillary won, this same willful blindness would have continued and they would have doubled down on it. With the new administration, there are many good and honorable people serving who are trying to shift the battleship. But the reality is a great many of those same individuals who were engaged in the willful blindness in the Obama administration remain in every agency. And so the role of the men and women in this room, the role of the leaders of Congress who are here, the role of the Center for Security Policy and Frank Gaffney, the role of all of us is all the more important to continue shining the light on the threat, the existential threat that jihadists, that Islamists pose, to call them by their name and to stand up and defeat them. The men and women in this room are committed to doing that. And I'll tell you, I am deeply honored to stand shoulder to shoulder with you, with that same spirit everyone here is evincing that we saw from the heroes in Hurricane Harvey or in the aftermath of the church shooting in Sutherland Springs, to call out the truth and to defend the greatest nation in the history of the earth, the United States of America.